Hello, everyone. Today we have the honor of being joined by Tyler Vela, who is someone that just recently debated against my last guest on this channel, Warren McGrew, on the topic of God's omniscience. And today we're going to be hearing his perspective and his take on the debate, as well as getting to know more of his own personal views on different things, one in particular having to do with Calvinism. So let's begin. Thank you so much, Tyler, for coming today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And thank you. You're, I think, one of the first people that's ever said my last name right. So good job.
Yeah, I heard someone else say your last name and I'm like, did I say it wrong this whole time? They say Vela, right?
Yeah, they normally say Vela, Villa, and you nailed it. So thank you.
Is that Hispanic or?
It is, yeah.
Out of curiosity. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So can you share a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I grew up in a non-Christian home. So I grew up in a largely secular family, not atheistic or antagonistic, just religion wasn't a thing. My mom was I call her a retired hippie, just kind of a spiritual, but not religious whatsoever. And my stepdad was a recovering Catholic, but never talked about it. We didn't really have a Bible in the house or anything. And so I grew up that way. I became a pretty ardent atheist in my late teens until I was about 20 years old, when God got a hold of me and brought me home to himself. So I was actually in a philosophy program. So I was a double major in English and philosophy. And it was actually during that time that God started using some of the arguments for the existence of God in my metaphysics class with my very Canadian, very atheistic professor. God actually started using those to draw me home to himself and to tear down some of my naturalistic worldview that was there. And then through his providence and some means, brought me to a wonderful Christian church. Actually, I didn't like the morning regular adult service. It was actually at like the college age service in the evening that ministry was pivotal in bringing me home. So since then, because of my interest in English and philosophy, studied theology, systematic theology, historical theology, biblical studies. I got my degree in biblical studies. Is actually a pre-graduate degree from Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And then I'm still currently, although it's largely on hold because of COVID and some finances and stuff, a master's in theological studies at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte. So and then I host the Freed Thinker podcast, blog, and YouTube channel, which is dedicated, the podcast is mostly towards like these types of theological discussions, biblical theological discussions. When I do research papers on different exegetical points, it goes there on the podcast and the blog. The YouTube channel is really dedicated more towards apologetics and dealing with atheism and naturalism and skepticism and presenting a cogent, rational case for the existence of God and Christian theism in that regard. So that's me.
Would you describe yourself as a precept?
So I am precept with a bullet, is how I describe it. So I am philosophically and theologically presuppositional, but I will regularly clash with my fellow precepts because I am not methodologically presuppositional. So I'm not going to be the one running around and saying, well, how do you know, by what standard, all that kind of stuff. I think that I'm actually more Van Tillian than that, because Van Til was all about evidences. It's just that presuppositionalism, think of it as a meta apologetic. It's more of a framework that we understand apologetics and the role of arguments and argumentation and evidences and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Okay, and how about a little bit of your personal life? Are you a dad, or are you? I
am a dad. I have two little ones. Yep. So I have a 6-year-old and I have another that just turned 5. They are the love of my life. They actually painted beside these little dinosaurs back here. So they're all their little toys back on this side. So they are the beautiful 2 boys. So yes.
Good. I have two little ones too, 6 and 7. Let's talk about your debates. So I've seen you debate a lot online. One in particular, Layden and Braxton. I'm starting to listen to that debate. But have you done a lot of other debates?
Yeah, I haven't. I'm at the point where I've lost count. I think I've done probably 20 or 30 online debates. I've done a couple in-person debates. So I debated as part of the Mentionables apologetics group. I debated those conferences. Ben Watkins, who's an atheist, and then I debated R and Raw in person in a formal debate, stage debate. I've done lots of formal debates, informal kind of debate, but more like discussion, like rigorous dialogue, you could call it. Everything ranging from, you know, the historical Jesus to slavery in the Bible, to, you know, different views on Genesis 1, but you know, a lot geared towards Reformed soteriology and things along those lines. Had baptism debates, so I've done quite a few debates.
Wow, that's very impressive. Do you have any, do you have your own personal philosophy about debates, about like tactics, like any thoughts on that?
It's not my own philosophy. It is a point, and when we talk about the debate with McGrew, I'll bring this up. It's not my philosophy. It's just that I hold to kind of a classical understanding of debate and burden of proof and argumentation. So when someone takes the affirmative, they bear the burden of proof to demonstrate that affirmative case, and you don't demonstrate an affirmative case by doing a negative case against another view, for example, which is what McGrew did in our debate, for example. But that happens a lot of times with atheists, right? Atheists, they'll go on, you know, they'll take an affirmative position, right? Atheism is reasonable or whatever it is, but they'll spend their entire time saying, this is why you know, I think Christianity is bad. Right? Or this is why I think Tyler's, you know, when they're debating me, this is why I think his position is false, right? Well, even if they're successful in that case, which I don't think McGrew was, I don't think atheists typically are, even if that's successful, they haven't actually met their burden for their affirmative side. Likewise, the negative side, which I held in the debate with McGrew, I don't have a position that I need to affirm, right? My negative position I didn't have the burden to prove Reformed soteriology or classical theism. I could posit completely random views that I don't hold as defeaters for my opponent's view. All I need to do is make a negative case against the affirmative. So there's lots of things that go into debate strategy, but that kind of is the underlying, where I just think debates, there's very formalized rules for debates, and there's very clear structure about what is happening kind of polemically and what's just happening at that type of level. So typically when I go into debate, I'll try to make very clear who's affirming who has the negative side, what the burden is. And so usually you'll hear when I'm debating someone, the start of my opening statement typically will be of some kind of, let me explain what the debate is, like what is the actual topic, what's the burden, what do they have to prove, what do I have to prove, and we'll go from there. I want to make it very clear when we're doing a debate what that is.
What are your thoughts on Christians debating? Do you think, and in particular with this topic of like soteriology, do you think Christians ought to debate on things?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. You know, I know people like William Lane Craig have said he just refuses to do formal debates for in-house discussions, like on Molinism. He actually just today released he did kind of an informal discussion with James White on Molinism, which is really one of the first times he's done it. And a lot of people appreciate it, but it wasn't a formal debate. So I can appreciate that sentiment. You don't want to drive the wedge between people. However, I think debates and these types of discussions serve a very important pedagogical function. It's basically, right. So there's a little bit of inconsistency, and I pushed Bill Craig on this before. Is he will have that debate in moderated papers, right? So what's the difference between the papers being out there public and me saying what's in the paper to somebody and them responding and being able to give a rejoinder in the moment? As long as it stays charitable and kind and open, I don't actually see the problem with pushing each other's views for greater consistency, greater biblical accuracy, greater understanding. I don't personally see the issue with it. There are only really a handful of topics that I refuse to debate on, just because I think that the topic is just so silly that the side presenting it just, I don't know why we would give them a platform. So one of them, for example, is Jesus mythicism. I don't have them on my show. I don't debate them. It's literally the historical equivalent of Holocaust denialism. So like zero scholars hold the view. Why would we even give it a platform? Those are the, there's only a handful of those for me though, that I hold to. Otherwise, even if I think of you as silly, I think dynamic omniscience is blatantly and obviously wrong. But great scholars, like Sanders and others hold the view. And so I think it's important to have that discussion. I'm not gonna shy away from that or anything like that. So yeah,
I'm sure non-Calvinists appreciate that you're willing to engage with them. I'm really curious, after listening to the debate with Warren, what your own personal views are about, reform. Would you call yourself a reformed?
Yeah, I'm Reformed Presbyterian, so I'm about as reformed as reformed comes, with some caveats. I call myself a California conservative in some ways, which means some of the more aggressive views I don't hold when it comes to like political conservatism or theonomy or things like that. I also am, I've been ostracized somewhat for my views on Genesis 1 because I'm not actually a young earth or an old earth or a theistic evolutionist. I take I take a literary view of Genesis 1, which kind of puts me sometimes outside the camp. I'm fine with women in ministry. So there are some aspects of Reformed theology on kind of tertiary issues, but when it comes to basics of soteriology, covenant theology, ecclesiology, right there are I'm about as reformed comes. So
okay, and what about your views on omniscience? How did that impact the way that you debated Warren? Did that weigh anything at all? Or like if you would have used your Calvinism on the debate, like how would that have been even like a stronger case for you?
Yes. So the thing, and I said this in the opening, is the debate is not about Calvinism. It's not about Reformed theology. And every time he went after my view, it was rather irrelevant to the actual topic. Because I didn't actually argue from a Reformed perspective. I argued something that's consistent with Reformed theology. I argued from historic classical theism, right? I argued from basic classical Orthodox Christianity, which is that God's omniscience is perfect. God knows all things. He doesn't grow in knowledge. He doesn't learn new things, right? Things along those lines. If I had argued specifically from a Reformed view, then I would have argued further along lines. I could have taken that further, right? Because Reformed theologians we are classical theologians. We're Orthodox. William Lane Craig is Orthodox in that regard, right? So I would have been able to say, okay, beyond that, from a Reformed view, I can say the reason why God knows things, his knowledge is grounded in his own decree, right? God is the one that actually is the truth maker, is the thing that makes these things true. And he knows that they're true because he has decreed that they're going to be true. Otherwise there's not the question comes up, well, how does God know that something is true if he hasn't decreed that it be true, right? Because that now opens the question of, well, what is the ground of truth that isn't God? And so there's these grounding objections that come up, and Reformed theologians are very quick to point out that there's a grounding issue when you don't ground knowledge somehow either on God's decree, God's will, God's act of creation, right? There's got to be some type of grounding in God himself. Otherwise, these truth values are grounded in something outside of God. which then gets, you start getting kind of outside of the realm of, historic Christian orthodoxy, where God is the ground of all truth. God is the ground of all being. And so that raises those questions and some other questions of how then does God even know it? If there's nothing outside of God to create these things, there's nothing to make them truth value. What is there for God to even know? And this is why McGrew is an open theist, because he's going to say there is nothing for God to know yet in these regards, because God isn't the ground of truth. So that's how the view becomes stronger under Reformed theology. So.
Okay, so it has to do with grounding truth.
There's
disagreement.
That's a main reason. There's lots of different areas where the debate could have gone. I mean, I trimmed down my opening from about 45. I could do like a 45-minute run through of all the arguments that I would have wanted to make, and I had to trim it down to 15 minutes. I only made a handful of them. One of them that didn't really make it in would be with this grounding objection. Because that would be more of a specifically reformed objection to it.
Okay, that makes a little more sense to me. So let's go into how you might disagree that you did not misrepresent Warren.
That's right.
So why would you feel that way?
Yeah. So Warren is he's very keen to disprove Calvinism. And so it causes certain biases for him that drive his rhetoric. And that's okay. Everyone does it to a certain degree. It's polemical. It makes for good YouTube channels and so on. But when it comes to his actual view, just so the listeners are aware, myself and my friend Colton Carlson, we did a debate review that was far more comprehensive. If you want to go see like an hour and a half, 2-hour review, blow by blow, we would literally go line by line into Warren's opening, into some of the strategies that were employed and stuff. It's on the Gospel Truth YouTube channel. Hi, Marlon. You can go see that there. If you watch the opening from Warren, though, and he gives his definition of dynamic omniscience, it's so muddled that we re-listened to it like 4 or 5 times. No one defines it that way. No one defines it the way, and he doesn't even keep going through what that actual definition is. He actually states the definition and then argues something else. Dynamic omniscience is the view that God's knowledge itself is dynamic. It's changing. You're going to get this from Sanders and Haskell and everyone else. It's dynamic because it's growing as more things become true that God can know, right? That's the dynamic of it. Warren wants to say it's dynamic because God is living and all this kind of stuff, which, I mean, Calvinists agree that God is living. That's not a point of debate, right? So there's, to go from he's living to therefore it's dynamic, there are about 20 what are called enthymemes. There are 20 of these little unstated premises that have to connect from living to therefore God doesn't know the future, right? Whereas McGrew just kind of jumps from one to the other, right? But it's never proven, right? So throughout the entire debate, I'm trying to pin Warren down and say, your actual view, you need to defend it. You can't just assert it, and you can't make these leaps in logic of inference without actually proving the case in between. He does it throughout. And a pivotal point of this, I don't know if you want to get to the debate point yet, but this is really highlighted in how he actually responds to my view, because he's going to say my view entails what's called a modal collapse. But he uses the term modal collapse wrong. A modal collapse is when you invalidly distribute a modal operator. Something is necessarily the case, or something is contingently the case, or any type of adjectival use of certain things. And he wants to say that because I say that necessarily if God knows that something will happen, that it will happen, he wants to say that entails a modal collapse, that therefore The outcome is necessary. It couldn't be otherwise. God couldn't have contingent knowledge, couldn't have all this other kind of stuff. The problem with that is twofold. One of them is he's moving from what's called an internal critique to an external critique. An internal critique is saying, if Tyler's view is true, then this negative thing follows, right? They're typically called like reductio ad absurdums. If it's a reduction to absurdity, if this view is true on its own terms, then it entails this falsehood or this contradiction. It's a totally valid way to argue. The problem is that if to make your argument work, you have to bring in external things that the position doesn't hold. You've now moved from an internal critique to an external critique, and you're relying on something that isn't actually internal to the view. And so you're begging the question of a different view, right? So it's this weird type of objection it's kind of like a moving of the goalpost and a begging the question and a straw man all at the same time, right? So what he says is, well, on Tyler's view, right? Because my view is that if God knows something will happen, that it will happen. He wants to say, well, if that's the case, then it entails this modal collapse, because he thinks that determinism is fatalism, right? That's his unstated premise. But I don't agree with that premise, and that's not internal to my view. So he's brought in this external premise, right? Which makes this whole fallacy work. The other problem is that objection we just know is formally invalid, right? So my argument is that if God knows that something is the case, it will be the case. God knows it's the case. What logically follows from that is not what Warren thinks. Warren says what follows from that is necessarily it will happen, right? That's the modal collapse. He thinks that if God knows it'll happen, that necessarily collapses into the conclusion that necessarily it will happen. That's modal collapse. The problem is that's just formally invalid, right? We've known this since A.O. Quine. The modal, this is basic in modal logic. What follows is it will happen. It doesn't follow that necessarily it will happen. So let me give an example, right? If John has 3 children, and necessarily if John has 3 children, he has more than 2 children. It's just necessarily the case. Premise 2, John has 3 children. Warren wants the conclusion then, what those 2 premises entail, which I would affirm. He wants that to entail that, therefore, necessarily, John has more than 2 children. But that's just not the case. There are possible worlds where John has 1 child, where John has no children, right? That invalid movement, that modal collapse, just doesn't follow from the first 2 premises. It's actually Warren's objection that commits the modal collapse, right? It's not my position that commits the modal collapse. Does that kind of make sense and help that?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm sure other people will follow you even more than I am.
Well, let me give so that's kind of the abstract. He makes that argument, but he puts it in concrete terms. So let me show how in the concrete terms it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. He makes this big objection. He says Tyler is affirming a contradiction because he says that God can tenselessly know tensed facts. He's all up in arms about this. He wants to say there's no possible way that God can tenselessly know tense fact. To know a tense fact is to have tense knowledge, right? So he's going to say there's a contradiction. The Tyler's view commits a modal collapse, all this kind of stuff, right? I've disproven this so many times to McGrew that the more he keeps saying it, he either really doesn't understand it or he's dishonest. I'm going to go with that, but he doesn't understand it. But if he keeps going, it's hard to think that he's honestly engaging and not just kind of axe grinding, because we know that the form of his objection is invalid, and we can give countless counterexamples. So for example, it's a necessary fact that 2 + 2 is 4. That's just a necessary fact. There's no possible world where that's not the case, right? I can know that necessary fact. But does that mean that my knowledge of the necessary fact is necessary. So to know a necessary fact, do I have to necessarily know it? Clearly not. There was a time where I didn't know that. I don't know if is new news. I was an infant before. I was a baby. I didn't know that 2 + 2 = 4. I could go senile and not know that 2 + 2 is 4. Right? So it's my knowledge of 2 + 2 being a necessary fact is not itself necessary. Right? You can't invalidly distribute the modal operator. Right? I do the same thing with tensed. So for example, have you ever seen Star Wars?
No.
Star Trek, any of these other, they're not real world timelines.
Gotcha.
Right? Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth, different timeline. I can know the tensed fact that, I use Hamlet as an example. I can know the tensed fact that Ophelia will die with respect to Hamlet in the first act. Right? I know that as Ophelia will die, because that's the tense is relative to the timeline of Hamlet's Denmark, right? Does that mean that Ophelia will die? I know Ophelia will die. Does that mean that Ophelia's death is future to me? No, of course not. I know that tensed fact tenselessly with respect to the timeline that it's tensed. Right? The fact that it's tensed has nothing to do with how I know it. You can't draw the line back and forth between those two. That's to invalidly distribute a modal operator. Right? So I have zero problem saying, right? He's like, oh, well, Tyler can't know, or God can't know that Jesus is raised. Of course he can. God can know Jesus is raised tensed with respect to 21st century American us in this conversation, right? He can know that Jesus will be raised tensed with respect to Abraham. He can know tensed facts irregardless of whether his knowledge is tense. Again, this isn't even a controversial point in philosophy. This is like basic modal logic and structural logic. This is really, really, really simple. The same thing with his objections about contingent knowledge, right? God can know things that are contingently true, right? He just knows which ones will be true, but they're still contingent upon the context and the outcome and the truth makers and so on. So he knows that they're contingent. He knows counterfactual knowledge. He knows, had I created this other world, that would be the case, right? So it's just kind of silly every time McGrew makes these objections that God, well, if Calvinism is true and God's decree determines the truth values in the world, then he can't know counterfactual knowledge. Well, sure he can. He can know counterfactual, that had he made that world, then that would be what would be true. It's just trivially easy to overcome those types of objections because they're formally invalid.
Mm-hmm. I forgot to ask you, are you, I don't know if it's even relevant, are you a Molinist?
I'm not a Molinist for largely these same reasons.
Okay.
I object to Molinism for actually lots and lots of reasons. But this part of these issues that have to do with grounding objections and how God knows,
mm-hmm.
and these facts of, excuse me, Molinism requires you to assume libertarian freedom, but it's so that God can have middle knowledge, so God can actualize this world. But God actualizing this world means that he's determining that the truth values that make, let's call this world W1. It's called the actual world W1. W1 is just a set of true propositions. God determined that would be the set of true propositions and not some other true propositions. So he just determined it to be the case that you would freely choose to have this conversation with me, right? So on my view, that's fine because I'm a compatibilist. I think God can determine things that are free. I don't have a problem with that because God determines which world is true. And part of that is that we freely choose to do it. I don't have an issue with that. Molinist is going to say, well, you have to have libertarian freedom, which is an incompatibilist position. But then when you actually get to the metaphysics of what's created, it's a compatibilist position. So it's an incompatibilist compatibilist position, which is just a formal contradiction. So I just have lots of issues with Molinism apart from these discussions. So
okay, I wanted to ask because you kind of said some words like God could choose whichever world. That kind of reminds me of Molinism, but it's true for Calvinism as well.
It's true for any. I mean, any view can use multiple world semantics, right? Multiple world semantics is position independent, right? So we use multiple world semantics in all kinds of different things, even outside of questions of the relationship of divine sovereignty and mental knowledge. We use to talk about, problems of evil. We use to talk about even conceptual analysis of principles and just basic philosophy, and not even in theological discourse. So lots of people use possible world semantics.
Okay, so how about, can you explain if it is true or if it's not true in your view that you believe that God is static or that he's living?
Yeah, so this is again, I recommend people to go listen to the discussion that Colton and Marlon and I had on Marlon's channel. The problem with that is it's a false dichotomy. It's not an either or, right? So and McGrew wants to do, because he wants alive to mean non-static as opposed to static. Well, the question is, I don't even know what that means, right? So it depends on what you mean by static. If by static you mean something like God is immutable, where he's not changing in his essential attributes, then absolutely God is static, right? Does it mean that God can grow in his knowledge and change in his knowledge? If that's what you mean by static, sure, then that's what you mean by static. If you mean that God is either static or alive, well, no, then God is alive. He's not static. The problem is that what Warren wants to do is he wants to create an analytical identity between alive and static. But those just aren't conceptual, analytical, identical things, right? Those are two words that he's freighted certain meanings into, right? Certain uses. It depends on what you mean by those terms, whether or not they even have synthetic identity at that point. So if you have questions about analytic and synthetic identity, I can answer those. But it's just an equivocal use of those terms to create this kind of false dichotomy. So do I think God is living and active and sharper than any, and his word is sharper than any two-edged? Absolutely, I do. Do I think God is alive? Absolutely. I think he's the ground of all being. Do I think that God grows in his knowledge? No, because I think that God is perfect. Right. So, I continue to push back on the open theists of this question, because you have major problems when it comes down to a God who doesn't know certain things and the way they handle certain Bible passages. Right. So I regularly bring up Genesis 18 because they do, which is where God had to, on their view, God had to literally come down from heaven because he heard reports about the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plains. And he's coming to find out if they're true, right? Open theists like Chris Fisher and Will Duffy will make a lot of this. McGrew has as well, even though he tries to pretend that he hasn't. And they'll say, look, God doesn't know the future. He needs to come find out if they're true. Well, the problem is that in the verse, does that mean that God had to come down? He didn't know in heaven if it was currently the case that it was true, that they're evil. But if you actually read the passage, what he's coming down to find out is he's heard these past reports of evil, and he's coming down to find out if they're true, right? So they want to use this, and because they read all these passages, they don't read them historically how Christians read and understand language about God, which is by analogy and anthropomorphisms and the like. They read them literally. These are literal descriptions of what God has to do. And so their view entails that God literally in heaven doesn't know the truth of even past reports, right? Because they need this verse to show that God learns things, and they need this verse to show that God that God is mutable, and he changes and he grows in his knowledge. But when you actually hold them to consistently understand their hermeneutic, it entails all of these things that hopefully you and I would never affirm. because that's just kind of what comes out in the wash if they're going to be consistent in their handling of these passages.
So let me ask you this. In the beginning, you said that you take a literal interpretation of Genesis, right?
Take a literary interpretation.
Literary. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah. So I did about probably 20 hours of content on this on my podcast and YouTube channel. Very in a nutshell, there are what are called concordist views of Genesis 1 and non-concordist views of Genesis 1. A concordist view says that Genesis 1 is effectively some kind of scientific account of material origins. It's trying to tell us materially how God created the universe, whether that's a young Earth, old Earth, or kind of theistic evolutionary perspective. It's trying to explain material origins. A literary approach is going to say that's just not what it's trying to do, right? It's my view is that it is a polemical temple text. It is showing that God has established his throne from which he rules and reigns in his creation as the great high king. And it's a polemical. It shows that he is that over and against the gods specifically of Egypt and of later Babylon and Assyria. And so it's a literary tool. It's a literary telling of these polemical things. That doesn't mean that it's not historical, right? It's just that it's not historically telling about material origins. So I hold that it's a literary telling, not a literal telling. But even the most dispensational person, and this is the weird thing about open theists. Open theists tend to be kind of this almost like really hyper dispensationalist. For those of you who know what dispensationalism is, they push kind of the rigid literalistic hermeneutic of a dispensationalist to the nth degree, and it creates these weird things like in Genesis 18, whereas even dispensationalists who affirm literal interpretation, literal hermeneutics, is going to say, well, literal interpretation still means that you account for things like metaphor, symbol, and anthropomorphic language about God, right? Jesus is not a physical wooden door, and that's okay.
Okay, because there was a little bit of that going on in the debate or in the after comments. So maybe we can start going through the Twitter questions. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think there was a question having to do with that topic. Let's start with, we might as well go over Warren McGrew's question. What biblical passage teaches God is unthinking? And since we have a lot of them, maybe we want to answer them quickly so we can as many.
I'll try to keep them short. So again, I've corrected Warren on this multiple times. So the fact that he keeps asking this question, he's either not understanding the answer, which lots of other people, this isn't a Calvinist thing. This is Lutherans, Provisionists, Arminians. I've had all kinds of people say like, oh, your answer was actually really good. Thank you. That was clarifying. So the fact that he keeps asking this is, well, let's just call it suspect. It's not that God is I never said that God doesn't think or have thoughts. It's that when we talk about God having thoughts and thinking, they're not our types of thoughts and our type of thinking, right? It's analogical. So it's not that God is unthinking, right? My coffee mug is unthinking. It's not a thinking agent, right? It doesn't have beliefs or knowledge or anything like that, right? When we talk about God having knowledge or having thinking, I have knowledge because I am impacted by things. I come to know things. I go through a process of inference and deduction and reason and I procedurally arrive at knowing things. I have a thought process because we are creatures. We are material beings. We have a brain. That's how our brain functions. We're temporal. We have all these kind of things. So when we think, we go through a thought process. When we think, we are acted upon something. I think the sun rose this morning because the sun rising impacted me. I am passable. I am impacted by this external thing. My knowledge is derivative of something, right? Now think about God. Is God impacted, and does his knowledge derive from something else? Is his knowledge contingent upon the creation, or is God the ground of being, the ground of knowledge? Right. So does God learn something? Does he go, when God thinks, does he go through a process? Does God not know the outcome of a deductive argument until he procedurally goes through and he's like, oh, I'm glad that logically worked out, and I know that now, right? Under classical Orthodox Christianity, the answer is no. God knows those things because God is knowledge. God is perfect in knowledge. He doesn't have to go through the process of coming to know things. So when I say that God doesn't have thoughts, it's God doesn't have thoughts like we have thoughts. However, can we imagine what that looks like? Can I, as a finite temporal being, even imagine what that looks like for God to have that type of thought? I can kind of conceptually, I mean, I understand that it's not a contradiction. I can conceptually understand it, but it's like the Trinity. I can apprehend it. But when I actually try to conceive and construct kind of the metaphysics of it, right? I can't do that, right? The hypostatic union. How is it that we have one person with two 100% human and 100% man, 100% human and 100% divine, where there's no mixing, right? Well, does that mean that he has one will or two wills? Does that mean, right? You have all these questions that pour out of that. We have a hard time conceptualizing kind of the metaphysics, what that ontologically would look like. But that doesn't mean that we can't conceive of it still being the case. So when we talk about God, our language about God is by analogy, because we can only conceive of it in our own created temporal finite sense. So we use that language that's at our disposal, but we understand kind of the divine distance between the reality that is God and our language that describes God analogically. So and I know you want to do these quick, but I think they'll get quicker as it goes. This one it requires a lot of unpacking. So to say, well, why do you think God is unthinking? It's kind of like asking, well, when did you stop beating your wife? Right? I can't answer yes or no. I have to say the question itself is flawed somehow. The question itself is using the wrong tools, the wrong conceptual grid to get at what the actual state of affairs is. When have you stopped beating your children? Well, I never started beating my children, right? So the question isn't working on the right level. Right? Why is, so you say God is unthinking. Well, if I say yes, he hears, well, then God is like my cup, right? Or if I say, well, no, then he hears, oh, well, then he's like me, like a finite thinker, right? And I'm going to say, well, the problem is that it's neither of those. You're just asking the wrong kind of question. And a lot of people get frustrated with these types of longer answers, and it's, you're just trying to, you can't answer the simple yes or no question. Well, sometimes questions are just bad questions. And sometimes the answer is more complicated than the simple question, because it's simple because it's just wrong. And so it takes longer answers like this. So I hope that answered it.
Yeah, that was actually a good one that you took your time on answering. Really quick, would you say that you said that God is knowledge, or would you say that knowledge is an attribute of God?
Yeah, so this is where I'm going to try to answer this as simply as I can, but you've now hit on a very important thing in classical theology, right? And that is that God is simple. God isn't composed of parts. So it's not the case that God is this thing that has this part called knowledge, right? So we talk about things and we say someone has knowledge. Knowledge is a predicate. It's a description of something about me, right? It's a component of me, right? God isn't composed of parts. He's not subdivisible, right? Because if God is the ground of all being, that means God is the ground of all being. Well, if God is composed of parts, that means there's actually things that are more essential than God, right? God relies on the existence of these parts to make up himself, right? So now God isn't actually love. God is loving, right? Which sounds similar to us, because to us, when someone is loving, we are an instantiation of love. Love kind of it exists in us, but we aren't by nature love, right? So think about, is God love by nature, or is God loving? Is it that God is just a really, really, really good, maximally loving thing, where love is this abstract thing that isn't actually identical with God, but just God's this instantiation of this loving thing? Well, if that's the case, then God isn't the ground of love. Love is actually grounding what God is. So you have these almost like, it's funny. It's weird that McGrew and others will say that classical theism is Platonic theology, because it relies on these abstract concepts, when really classical theology is the opposite. We're saying, well, no, there aren't these abstract objects that exist that ground God. God just is these things. God just is justice. He just is not. God is identical with these things, and they're not divisible into parts. So I hope that someone answers the question.
Yeah. But you would stay away from, for example, is it the word attributes, or would you kind of define it differently? But do you still accept that God has attributes, even though they don't?
Yeah. So I'm fine again. So I'm fine talking about this. This is where there's kind of the colloquial use, even like the systematic theology use. And then there's like the really, if you want to be tightly philosophical use of terms. So in systematic theology, we typically talk about communicable and incommunicable attributes and attributes of love, right? Because again, we're just going to say, okay, to function, to even talk about God, we have to use our language. We just have to. There's no other way to talk about God, right? And that's okay, as long as we understand kind of in the background this caveat of, again, there's this divine distance between our language and how we talk about God and what actually God is in himself.
Yeah. And how would you understand that God made us in his image? Mm-hmm. Does that relate at all to how we're able to understand him through language?
It does. It does very much. Analogical language, the classical view that our language is analogical to describe God, is rooted, actually, if you read a lot of the literature, it's rooted in this idea that the creature is imago Dei, right? God in and of himself is love underived. He's not love because things are lovable and drive him to love them. I love my children in a derivative way, right? I love them in response to their being lovable. And I don't just mean like, they're lovable. I mean, like they are lovable agents. They are worthy of my love, but that impacts me and causes me to have this reaction to be a loving person towards them, right? So, but that's because I am a creature that's in God's image. My love is derivative of something else. Right? God's love is not derivative. It's not a component of who he is. God, and this is where like impassibility comes in respect, where God doesn't experience as a patient, as a subject emotion. He's not moved to emotion in response to us contingently, but we are. That's how we experience, because we are contingent upon other things for us to instantiate those emotions and those responses. Because we are derivative, we are creations, we are creatures. we image God, we reflect that, but we do it in a finite, creaturely way, whereas God does it in a perfect, essential way in himself. It's not derivative. It's not contingent, whereas ours is.
I understand. So how about Warren's second question? Does God have accidental properties? Cambridge changes.
Yeah. So this, I'm going to answer this. I'm going to try to answer this in under a minute. Accidental properties is a philosophical view that so I have my essential properties, which are core to myself. I have the accidental property of wearing this shirt or of sitting down, right? It's an accidental property of myself. There is in the philosophical literature, there is a lot of discussion about God doesn't have accidental properties in the strong sense that he has those types of, it's not that God is temporarily standing up one day and sitting down the next day. It's not that God has the accidental property of not being incarnate one day and being incarnate another day, right? However, and this again is just basic in the literature. This is throughout classical theism. So the fact that McGrew thinks that this is a big challenge because he's relying on Ryan Mullins and some other people, there's so much literature for Aquinas was talking about these things, that there are relational accidental properties, and those are not the same thing. So God can stand, the divine nature can stand relationally to certain things without it actually creating an accidental property within the divine nature itself. And so that is the distinction. So when he says, does God have accidental properties? Well, do you mean kind of ontological accidental properties? These kind of situational accidental properties? No. Do you mean relational accidental properties that's replete with throughout the literature? Yes. And that's, again, this is just basic stuff. So when he asks those questions, I just want to say, are you just hearing someone say that these are challenges, but not actually reading the literature? Because this is just addressed all over the place in the literature.
Okay. The Sire asks, what do you think about Calvinists that reject classical theism?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that Calvinists and Reformed folks, hi buddy, I think that they shouldn't reject classical theism. I don't think anyone should reject classical theism, because I think classical theism is the most robust philosophical understanding that is derivative of biblical Christianity. I say it that way because I don't think that there is a single verse, for example, that says God is impassible, right? I think classical theism, in the same way as Trinitarianism, right, where we hold Orthodox Trinitarian views, we hold Orthodox Trinitarian views that are most consistent with the teaching and proclamations of the Scripture. So there's not going to be a single verse that says God is triune, right? That is a good and necessary consequence of numerous passages throughout the Bible. I think the thing is true of classical theism. I think classical theism is a good and necessary consequence of the scriptural teaching. It's not just taking man-made philosophy and reading it back onto the text. So I think that people who are Reformed or Calvinistic should not jettison classical theism in that regard. I also think it's very interesting. This is just my observation. I think some philosophical studies have borne this out. The more people reject classical theism, the more other central doctrines start to go. So you'll notice Warren rejects classical theism. He now starts to reject omniscience. He now starts to reject penal substitutionary atonement. He now starts to reject any meaningful understanding of the hypostatic union. When you actually push him and Duffy and others on their Trinitarian theology, it starts to get problematic. Right. So the instant you kind of, because classical theism is like a ball of yarn, it's not a bunch of different individual things. When you pull at one, it's like the Weezer song, when you pull at the sweater, the whole sweater comes undone. And a lot of things start to go. And we've started to see that as Molinism starts to advance, and as these non-classical views start to advance, we start to see the rise of these same groups also denying these other really long-standing core orthodox views within Christian theism.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end our conversation because my little son needs me.
He's adorable though.
Feeling too well after his dentist appointment. So thank you so much, Tyler, for your time. And this has really been very educational. I appreciate hearing your perspective. And I think you've definitely given us a lot of food for thought. So if people want to follow you, I'll leave your links in the description of this video. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.